Over the past year, I made a couple of videos about natural dyes and pigments. And, dear viewer, your comments have brought up a couple of really interesting questions that I'm hoping to answer eventually. I'm starting on kind of a series of scientific inquiries regarding natural dyes. Today's example dye plant is the cherry laurel. Cherry laurel is a popular hedging plant, and some of them produce berries. I collected a pound of cherry laurel... cherries? Berries? I'll call them berries. And from what I read online, I was expecting a grayish-blue dye from them. And because we're being scientific, I'm going to write stuff down. First off, I'll try to establish what difference a soy milk mordant makes. Half my examples will be pre-treated and half won't. Then I'll compare acids. The two I've chosen are citric acid and vinegar. I chose them because they are cheap and widely available. After that, I'll use heat on half the samples. That means I'll iron them. I've chosen 4 types of sample to dye. 2 paper, first a standard copier paper and then some fancy acid-free cotton paper. And 2 fabrics, a linen and a cotton muslin. Starting out with the soy mordant. Mordant comes from the Latin for bite. Mordants rough up the fiber of whatever it is you're dyeing, and that allows the dye to attach more easily. There's a few different types of mordant. Cow milk, iron, a bunch of others. Trying out different mordants could be a topic for a future video if you're interested. Today I'm using soy milk as a mordant. I have 4 of each sample prepared and 2 will go into the soy milk bath. I'll leave them in until they are saturated and then take them out to dry. The protein in the soy milk will attach to the fibers and accept the dye more readily later. At least that's the theory. We'll see. I gave all the samples 3 rounds of mordant bath. Now, to keep track of which samples are which, I'll keep the ones treated with soy on green plates and the ones without on blue. I've reached the part where things get a little bit exciting. I'm using 2 pots to make dye liquids. I'm doing my best to make both dyes as similar as I can, so we can compare the difference afterwards. So, each pot gets half the berries I gathered, and half a liter of water in each pot. Now I faced a little bit of a pickle. What is a comparable amount of vinegar and citric acid? In the end, I decided, and this might be a bit of a cop-out, I just used as much as I usually would for this amount of dye. So, in my mind, for this size pot, I'd use about 75 milliliters of vinegar or 1 teaspoon of citric acid. I'll leave it to cleverer minds than myself to establish a conversion rate. Now the pots go on the stove at the same temperature for the same amount of time, 25 minutes. I'm just sorting my samples. I'm starting the dyeing with the treated ones. The plate on the left will be dyed with the citric acid and the ones on the right with vinegar. That post-it decided to be an absolute pain, but it makes for good slapstick content. Almost forgot the alum. I'm not going to do any testing here. Alum is a fixative that has been used since the Middle Ages, so I assume more competent people than myself have done the testing and decided that alum is the way to go. I'll take their word for it. I'm adding 1 teaspoon to each pot once it starts cooking. Both dye pots are looking pretty good. Frankly, the smell of boiling vinegar is almost enough to call the whole thing off, but I'll power through. First samples in the pot. I'm trying to keep an eye on the clock to make sure that each sample gets equal time in the dye. 1 minute for cotton paper, linen and muslin, and 25 seconds for the copier paper. The reasons for the shorter dye time will become pretty obvious later on, but I'll point it out then. A little late, I realized I probably should not dip the same tongs in both vats over and over, since that would mix up the dyes, so I got out my eyebrow tweezers. Alright, we've got our first result. The citric acid makes the color redder, vinegar gives a lovely purple. This was a bit of a surprise, since accounts from other people who dyed using cherry laurel got a bluish grey, but let's be honest, I'm not mad. Here I'm putting in the copier paper, and the citric acid bath started fizzing slightly and the paper developed bubbles on the surface. I'm assuming the bleach in the paper reacts with the acid, but that is very much a guess. The paper did not react with the vinegar dye in the same way, it just went in and out no problem. Now, because of the bubbling, the paper became quite brittle, and I was worried leaving it on the plate to dry it might get stuck and tear, so I transferred everything onto kitchen towels. Probably a good idea either way. As I said, I can't explain the effect of the copier paper, but I'm delighted with the result. Overall, the colors are both really vibrant, and they will change a bit once they dry, but for now, vinegar gives purples, citric acids pinkish reds. Swiftly moving on to the samples that were not treated with soy mordant. Again, the plate on the left will be dyed, no, not the plate. The samples on the left will be dyed with citric acid and the ones on the right hand side with vinegar. I know all of this is really repetitive, but I'm trying to be as clear as possible for anyone who wants to replicate the dyes so they sort of know what to expect. By the by, and completely unrelated, I had an idea for my witchy friends. One could, if one wished, add some herbs to the dye pot, maybe speak a few words, and soak, for example, well wishes into a paper you dye and then use to wrap a birthday present. Or intent into a letter to a friend. The cotton muslin seems to have been treated with some sort of coating, so it doesn't take on the dye as readily. There are patches where no dye has been absorbed and the beige muslin is visible. Pre-wash your fabrics is what we learned here. Again, the copier paper is doing its fizzing and bubbling. I'm currently not seeing any difference in the samples. Both of those treated with soy and those without have pretty intense color, except for the muslin, but that's my fault because I didn't pre-wash the fabric. All the dyeing is done. I'll give them a day or two to dry and develop the final color. I noticed in previous dye experiments that the color shifts slightly for the first few days, until it settles to its final hue. But I am very happy with the colors, especially the copier paper. What a happy accident. That effect is so pretty. Without mordant, the color is majority blue with red spots, and with, mostly red with blue spots. I did not want to waste the dye liquid, so I turned it into ink. I have a whole video about making ink from berries, which I will link. This is the ink with citric acid, and I'm using standard watercolor paper, nothing fancy. And it starts out very red, but shifts blue as it dries. I'm assuming from the acid in the paper again? The vinegar ink needed some thickening up, so I added a teaspoon of gum arabic. This ink starts out blue and pretty much stays there. And I should have waited for the bubbles on top of the ink to pop before using it, but it's been a long day and I'm about to lose the light, so I just went for it. Let's look into the results. The samples are dry and any color development is done. I divided the paper into soy mordant and untreated, and vinegar and citric acid. The linen don't have any difference in intensity of color. The color is quite different. Citric acid gave me pinks and vinegar's lavender color with spots of purple. Muslin, pretty much the same picture, except the muslin that wasn't treated with soy mordant and dyed in vinegar that has some spots where no dye was absorbed. The muslin, I guess, had some kind of coating which both of the soy mordant and the citric acid washed off, but the vinegar didn't. Now the fancy cotton paper. Didn't develop as intense a color as the other samples, and some cooked cherry got stuck on one side of the paper here. I really should have caught that. The cotton paper that was dyed with vinegar has developed purple in the center and pink edges, which that's really pretty effect too. There is a slightly deeper color on the sample that was not treated with soy but dyed with citric acid. Now, the star of the show, copier paper. Who would have thought? The effect on the samples dyed in citric acid is so cool. Again, I believe it's due to the bleach in the paper that reacts to the acid, but not the vinegar, but honestly that's a total guess. And unless the internet lied to me, mixing bleach and vinegar produces chlorine gas, but I assure you, I did not poison myself. Either it only produced a tiny amount, or the internet lied, or maybe I'm immortal. 3 perfectly reasonable explanations. Now, for the final part of this entirely scientific study, heat. I'm ironing half of each sample and I'm running this footage pretty quickly because nothing exciting happened. In a few samples the color seemed to change, but that was just shadows, or rather lack of shadows on the iron parts. Heat, from what I read, is supposed to make the color stay vibrant for longer. So this is kind of a long-term experiment and I will post updates on my Instagram. And then I knocked my tripod over. So all the samples back in their piles, and this one, the untreated muslin that was dyed with vinegar, is the only one where heat may have made a difference in the color, but only slightly by brightening the color. Since I want to keep an eye on these samples and how the color develops, I'm going to frame them to hang them on my wall. James Dean will have to move, I'm sorry. I'm mounting the samples on fabric to avoid any acid from the backing paper changing the color, and I've chosen green because that just looks really cute. On the back I'm noting which samples sit where for future reference. Note-taking has saved my vegan bacon quite a few times in this process. I laid out the pieces and then used double-sided sticky tape to stick them to the backing fabric. And I wish it was less sunny, but I don't control the weather. After all that, my scientific findings are as follows. Pre-wash your fabrics, very important. Soy mordant is not super important. The color changes quite drastically depending whether you use citric acid or vinegar. Copier paper in acidic dye gives the coolest effects, and I'm going to write all my letters on acid-dyed copier paper from now on. Any further results will emerge in their own good time, and I'll keep you updated. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, why not subscribe?